Everyday Samurai, Episode 24. Greetings, friends, and welcome to Everyday Samurai, in service to your liberty and the security of a free state. Best wishes to you, my friends. I'm so glad to have you joining us to explore martial virtue and political economy, to create a more secure and prosperous world for ourselves, those we care about, and our posterity. Thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing the show, spreading the word with those you know that may be receptive to these ideas. Another big help is to offer a thumbs up or a positive review on iTunes or the podcatcher of your choice. Building a culture of principle-oriented people that understand the science of justice, as well as what it takes to put these principles into operation, is the only way to overcome the great dysfunction and confusion manifest in the world today. Perhaps you'll agree that evidence of injustice, ignorance, and delusion is pretty easy to find. Just look at the latest headlines or scan your social media feed for a few of these incidents. Maybe you've heard about studies showing negative psychological and health effects, depression, and even erectile dysfunction related to spending too much time on social media. Personally, I'm making a conscious effort to limit my time on social media and, most particularly, avoiding time wasted bickering over differences of opinion. How about you? Do you ever notice how much time you spend going back and forth on Facebook or Twitter without ever reaching some kind of resolution? It's rather unsatisfying in the long run, I think, and it's kind of wasteful to argue in those forums. Although, in some ways, social media can be used to raise awareness, and potentially this can lead to lasting change. This can be a good thing, perhaps, but as we know from the science of political economy, like all things in the material realm, time is a finite resource. We have to think of our time spent on any activity as either an investment or an expenditure. Time is either productive or it is consumptive. Time is never idle. Time does not stop. It keeps moving whether we are aware of it or not. It is only people that can be idle with their time, and while I value relaxation and consuming leisure, I would much rather use my time productively, moving toward my desired goals and working creatively at things I enjoy. One such thing is producing content for this podcast. That is not to say social media is a total waste. Awakening people to the universal truths discovered through the principles of edged weapon combat, epitomized by the samurai, as well as those of political economy and the study of human action, can also benefit from social media. I'm not suggesting anyone to avoid Facebook or Twitter or any other technology if it assists in the achievement or furtherance of a goal. The goal could be as simple as connecting with friends from around the world, or it could be as noble as propagating a revolution, as it did for a time in 2011 with the so-called Arab Spring. Incidentally, since I was working African-related security issues during that time, the Arab Spring holds a special place in my mind. It began as a series of uprisings in Morocco, Syria, Libya, Egypt, and Bahrain, all beginning when a street vendor, a 26-year-old named Tarek Mohammed Bouazizi, lit himself on fire to protest the police confiscating his livelihood, a cart of fruit and vegetables. Now, whether the police repeatedly harassed and destroyed Bouazizi's merchandise because they wanted a bribe or because he didn't have a license really doesn't matter. Apparently, the local administrative office requires no permits to sell from a cart. The point being that state interference with private property and the free exchange of goods between consenting adults is what provoked such a tragic act of self-immolation from a desperately poor young man, and the further violence and bloodshed throughout the region. If you're an American or live in a relatively peaceful and developed country, you might be asking, well, what's this got to do with me? I bring up the Arab Spring because it highlights the corruption of law and justice in striking detail. The Wikipedia page for the Arab Spring highlights the causes, in addition to Bouazizi's suicide by fire, as authoritarianism, dictatorship, demographics, energy crisis, corruption, sectarianism, poverty, unemployment, and kleptocracy. While demographics and sectarianism may be largely outside the realm of politics, and in the future we can discuss how government policies may impact those areas as well, but For the most part, every other factor listed for causing the Arab Spring is directly attributable to state action, or, more specifically, actions carried out by individuals in an official government capacity. The most important word to focus on is kleptocracy. Taken directly from the ancient Greek, it means the rule of thieves. A kleptocracy is characterized by those in power exploiting the people and a country's resources to extend their own personal wealth and political authority. A kleptocracy is a government ruled by corrupt politicians who use their political power to receive kickbacks, bribes, and special favors at the expense of the populace. Kleptocrats may use political leverage to pass laws that enrich them or their constituents, and they usually circumvent or undermine the rule of law. Does this sound familiar to you? This phrase, the rule of law, can also be tricky when unguided by principle. Thankfully, those familiar with our previous podcast will recall that scientific law is very simple. Do all you have agreed to do and do not encroach upon other people or their property. These two statements are the basis of contract and criminal law. Every piece of politically derived legislation actually undermines the rule of law. Africa offers the clearest examples of kleptocracy in existence today, and I say this not because it is absent elsewhere, quite the contrary. African nation-states were carved out of territories where statehood is a foreign concept. The African nation-states in existence today are but rebranded kleptocracies established by European colonizers, specifically set up to steal resources. Nothing changed structurally to the African nation-state when Europeans ostensibly handed over control to the local elites. There may be an African face as the head of state, but the state apparatus remains a tool of expropriation. African nation-states are just more blatant in their thievery, and since the contrast between filthy rich and dirt poor is so stark, the corruption stands out more clearly. The Arab Spring was undoubtedly a manifestation of global communications and connectivity. The material abundance and well-being enjoyed by the developed world is visually accessible to hungry and desperate Africans because of television, movies, and the internet. They see what is possible for them. I'll go into the great potential in Africa another time, but allowing the African nation-state to inform our understanding of kleptocracy is useful because we can compare it to the science of justice and political systems that actually deliver peace and prosperity. Understanding the world and gaining a higher perspective requires seeing things from outside your comfort zone. A great way to expand your horizons is to learn a foreign language. Not only do you get to communicate with people of another culture, but you also stimulate the neural pathways of your brain. That's right, challenging yourself to learn a foreign language will actually make you smarter in other ways and even possibly more physically agile. You have to keep your mind engaged with new challenges, particularly as you age, so now is the time to learn the foreign language you've always wanted to. Get a free 2-week trial to Rocket Languages when you go to www.everydaysamurai.life/rocket. That's everydaysamurai.life/rocket. Another way to say what we do here is examine the principles that help to build a free society through the dual path of scholarly and martial sciences. We take the hard-learned lessons of edged weapons combat derived from Japan's legendary warriors, the samurai, because a blade cannot lie. A blade has but one function, and that is to cut. A blade cannot help but cut because that is simply what it does. I know, technically speaking, a blade can either slice, chop, or pierce, yet these three actions are included in what I mean by cutting. In learning to survive and even prevail in the arena of edged weapons combat, high-level samurai had to shape their bodies in a way that allowed them to move into a position where they could cut without being cut. They learned right away that a physical body cannot share space with an edged weapon. The blade will always win over flesh, and no amount of muscle will change this fact. This is why samurai trainers like James Williams of Nami-Ryu Aikiheiho will say when working with edged weapons, if it's red, you're wrong. This means that if you get cut, it is not the blade's fault. The blade did its job. The blade is telling you the truth. The truth is, if you get cut, you failed to appreciate the blade in its force of movement. Training in samurai-related edged weapons combat teaches first and foremost respect for the nature of the blade and its undeniable truth, that cutting down a force vector is what it does, and arguing against this reality is futile. If only this level of truth resulting from understanding edged weapon engagements were to be found on social media. I recently shared an article on Facebook and almost immediately found myself drawn into explaining why social contract theory is bogus. In a sense, I guess this exchange was productive because it helped me clarify my own thinking, and now I get to share it with you. Hopefully it will help you also gain some clarity and perhaps even dispel the myth of a social contract in more people's minds. You know, the social contract has been used for quite a while to explain civic obligations. It almost is on par with what we now call the farcical divine right of kings, when you give it just a moment's logical scrutiny. Social contract theory has been used to justify the kleptocratic state for quite a while, even and especially within developed Western nations. I'll start by reading from a piece by Georgetown professor and political philosopher Jason Brennan. It's titled, "When Nonviolence Isn't Enough." Quote, "Some people think it's obvious why the government and its agents enjoy special immunity. They say that governments, or at least democratic governments, have a special moral power called authority. Authority means that when the government issues certain commands, edicts, regulations, or laws, it thereby creates, in the rest of us, a moral duty to obey. This argument that governmental special immunity rests upon political authority has two major problems. One is that there's little reason to think governments have authority, period. The other is that even if governments have some authority, there's little reason to think that they have the authority to violate our rights, abuse their power, or cause us severe harm. Philosophers have spent 2,500 years trying and failing to justify the idea that governments have authority. But, and this seems to be the consensus in philosophy today, none of the arguments really works. For instance, your 6th grade civics teacher probably told you that government has authority because of a social contract. You agree to obey, and the government agrees to protect you. But the social contract metaphor falls apart. Contracts are voluntary, but you never consented to and have no right or opportunity to opt out of the contract with your government. Contracts require mutual exchange, but U.S. courts have repeatedly ruled that the government has no obligation to protect you, even if you pay your taxes and obey the laws. Plus, even if you were to agree to a social contract, you'd have no good reason to give up your right to self-defense against government abuse. Even absolutist Leviathan author Thomas Hobbes thought such rights remain with the people. Other philosophers, such as H.L.A. Hart and John Rawls, say that government authority arises from a duty of fair play. They say your neighbors help provide beneficial public goods, but when they do, since you benefit, you should do your share. The fair play theory may explain why a person should pay taxes and serve on juries, but it would be bizarre to say, you benefit from some of the public goods the state provides. In order to avoid unfairly free riding on the efforts of others to provide those public goods, you must not only pay taxes, but you must also allow the president to exterminate and forcibly relocate Native American tribes. You must let police choke subdued and handcuff men to death. You must allow Congress to wage war at will. You must allow the police to arrest you for smoking pot or selling big gulps. Those things have nothing to do with paying your fair share, playing fair, or avoiding free riding. Anyone who wants to defend the special immunity thesis on the basis of government authority has a serious burden. It's not enough to justify a general kind of government authority. One must instead explain why democratic officials have the specific authority to commit severe injustices, the kinds of injustices where it would be valid for us to use violence, subterfuge, or deception against civilians if the civilians were to try to commit them. Suppose a police officer, following the Fugitive Slave Act, arrests an escaped slave in antebellum America. Suppose I shoot the police officer in order to free the slave. Even if we suppose that the U.S. federal government in the 1850s was authoritative overall, it's implausible that citizens had a duty specifically to let it enforce human slavery. Maybe governments have authority over some issues, but that doesn't justify granting their officials special immunity from defensive action. So let's go looking for other possible reasons to believe the special immunity thesis. Some people say that we should not resist government injustice but use peaceful methods instead. We may vote the bastards out, vote in better bastards, protest, write letters, or post scathing memes on Facebook. Of course, it's a basic rule of self-defense that we cannot use violence if peaceful alternatives are just as effective. Violence is allowed only if necessary. That holds regardless of whether you're defending yourself from abusive police or an abusive spouse. But more fundamentally, this argument misses the point. Remember, defensive actions are about stopping an immediate injustice from occurring, not about altering the rules or affecting who rules. Voting blocks sometimes change bad laws. Protesting sometimes gets a local police department to hire better staff or offer better training. But in the heat of the moment, as Officer Daniel Pantaleo chokes Eric Garner to death over selling untaxed cigarettes no less, you're not going to save him by writing a letter to a newspaper editor. Some people say that the moral parity thesis is dangerous because too many people will bungle it up. According to this objection, the problem isn't with the principle of self-defense, it's that we're bad at applying it. People will mistakenly conclude that they may lie, deceive, or resist police, even when they should not. I should keep my mouth shut, lest I induce you all to start firebombing Congress. But if anything, this objection gets the psychology backward. In real life, most people are deferential cowards, all too willing to abide the gassing of Jews, torturing of prisoners, or bombing of innocent civilians because their governments order it. Few people stand up for themselves or others against officials in positions of authority. If anything, proponents of the special immunity thesis should keep their mouths shut, lest they corrupt us even further. People are far more likely to obey Stalin when they should have deposed him than they are to stand up to a cop when they should have backed down. Still others say that we must not defend against government officials because we have a prohibition against vigilante justice in our society. The idea is that when a stable, workable, and fair public system of justice is in place, we must let it handle criminal justice matters rather than take justice into our own hands. Fair enough, but also irrelevant. Sure, if the police are saving your neighbor from being mugged, you shouldn't intervene. They probably will handle the situation more competently than you. But if the police ignore or simply cannot stop the mugging, you most certainly may intervene. Others say these ideas are dangerous because governments might respond badly to the resistance. If citizens defend themselves, the state might double down on its oppression. Indeed it may, though we should be careful in assessing how this affects our duties. Imagine a bully who says to you, "If you don't give me your lunch money, I'll beat up 2 other kids and take theirs." Does his credible threat eliminate your right of self-defense? If anything, there's reason to think that those worries about potential fallout don't apply so strongly to democratic governments. Sure, police respond to resistance with increased violence and militarization. Most people think it would have been justified, however, to assassinate Mao or Hitler. Yet historically, dictatorships have responded to assassinations by killing civilians and crushing civil rights. When Fanny Kaplan tried but failed to kill Lenin, Lenin unleashed the Red Terror. In contrast, when democratic leaders are assassinated, not much happens. 4 U.S. presidents and 13 congresspersons have been killed, and a few others have been targets. None of these events caused humanitarian disasters or terror purges. The U.S. government has committed and continues to commit many atrocities, but not in response to assassinations. Police officers enforcing the law may think they have no choice. After all, we the people make the law, with some help from our duly elected representatives, appointed officials, and various lobbyists. The police promise to enforce whatever laws we hand them. This view of policing fundamentally misunderstands moral responsibility. It's true that we sometimes ask soldiers, police bureaucrats, and others to enforce unjust laws. We the people often deserve the blame for creating bad laws. But police can and should say no. Better yet, they should lie and say yes, but then choose not to enforce the bad laws. Government agents don't relinquish personal moral responsibility by agreeing to wear a uniform in exchange for a paycheck. Close quote. Posting this resulted in a friend and former law enforcement colleague, a full-blown socialist I might add, asking if I thought choosing to live in a particular society constituted an agreement between an individual and the society at large. To this I responded, no. My friend then asked me a series of questions, all based upon an assumed social contract, such as choosing to remain in a society and receiving benefits from society, etc., and finally asking, if you do not believe that society is a voluntary association of individuals with more or less common goals, culture, language, etc., then what constitutes a society? Like I said earlier, there can occasionally be great nuggets of wisdom derived from these social media exchanges, because my friend, in his socialist fog, fell into a typical conceptual trap. Do you know what it is? It's actually quite easy to fall into given the amount of statist conditioning existing today, not the least of which is the indoctrination centers known as public schools. You see, society is an abstraction. There can be no agreement between an individual and society because society does not actually exist. Similarly, and for the same reason, an individual cannot contribute to the good of society. Individuals can only create positive externalities for the other individuals around them. This is why Brennan rightly states that philosophers have failed for over 2,500 years to justify political control, and its relatively new iteration, social contract theory. While useful as a descriptive term, one cannot study society without describing individual behaviors. Collections of individuals that share a common affinity, whether that be ethnic, linguistic, religious, or what have you, are likely to exhibit similar genetic or behavioral characteristics, IQ being one, and they may share mutual concerns. These individuals could then be termed a society and appropriately described as exhibiting certain patterns of behavior, generally and understood within standard distributions, usually depicted with a bell curve. However, the state injustice that Brennan describes most easily arises whenever someone starts talking about society having more or less common goals. The list of actually verifiable common interests shared by individuals within a society is extremely limited, and failure to explicitly identify who will do what using which resource only invites corruption. This corruption begins with substituting abstractions for actual human beings. Abstractions have no will, they have no agency, and they offer no feedback. They are used by people to describe things and then erroneously ascribed human characteristics, like will and agency. This kind of sloppy terminology is what leads to expenditures from the public treasury on impossible endeavors like wars on poverty, drugs, terrorism, etc. One cannot wage war on terror or terrorism, only on those individuals labeled terrorists. One cannot wage war on drugs. Drugs are inanimate objects. One can only wage war on the individuals who possess or consume drugs. One cannot fight poverty. Poverty is simply the absence of goods available for individuals to consume. The only way to overcome poverty is to produce more goods. One can easily understand why political actors enjoy speaking on behalf of abstractions like people, the children, or our country, and protecting them from other abstractions like terror, drugs, and poverty. In doing so, the politically savvy get to sound like they are acting benevolently, yet in actuality are only selfishly agitating for control of resources for their own aggrandizement at the expense of political subjects. Directing resources toward the satisfaction of legitimate human desire requires specificity, meaning who will do what, with what, to the benefit of whom, and at whose expense. In other words, the benefits of living in society can only be understood through the lens of human action, and the individual is the only suitable unit of analysis. Now that ends my response on Facebook, but it also reminded me of something I learned before I started studying political economy. It lines up perfectly with economics in the sense of the devil being in the details. Rather than going ahead with some lofty policy objective that will likely just further empower kleptocrats, we need to get into the habit of dispelling abstractions and looking for precision in our thought and speech. We need to know how using specific means will achieve a desired end. We need to demand precision from anyone championing an idea, particularly in the political sphere. Who is going to do what, specifically, and using what resources, to benefit whom? Drill this into your mind because it's the antidote to socialist impoverishment and tyranny. Anyone familiar with the science of sniping and precision marksmanship will understand the term minute of angle. That's where a rifle can be rated as having a 1-inch group at 100 yards. It's a measurement of expected accuracy. Yet when you take a minute of angle and expand that out from 100 yards to 200 yards, it actually turns into 2 inches. And at 300 yards, it's a 3-inch group. And at 400 yards, it's a 4-inch group. A minute of angle is simply a way of describing the expected accuracy of the rig and the effects of any deviation from that point of aim with that rifle are exacerbated the further out you go. Therefore, a lower minute of angle is required when you really have to have a precise shot. In the same way, we have to have this kind of precise thinking, otherwise we'll get perverted results. This kind of precision in your training and your thinking will also help you achieve the goals you want in life, and I'll describe it in detail in just a minute. But right now I want to remind you of how important it is for maintaining flexibility and mobility through regular exercise, meaning every day. We discuss some heavy topics on Everyday Samurai, and it is good that we do, but the very fact that we need to indicates the load of stress we are taking into our bodies. Add this to modern seated culture, and wringing the stress from your body becomes essential to maintaining your health. As martial artists, no doubt, you probably have some exercises in your own memory banks, but how many of us actually get to the gym or yoga class or the dojo on a daily basis? That's why the Ageless Mobility Reborn program is so great, because it keeps the joints healthy and lubricated, counteracting the negative influences stressing our bodies in our hectic modern lives. Plus, you don't need any equipment and you can get it all done within 10 or 20 minutes. So check it out at everydaysamurai.life/reborn. That's the Ageless Mobility Reborn program at everydaysamurai.life/reborn. Check it out today. So, to avoid falling prey to the abstractions kleptocrats use to steal from taxpayers, and to also be more effective in your day-to-day interactions, you can foster deeper understanding with the people you care about and work with, and you can insist upon precision. The precision model that I'll be talking about actually comes from Tony Robbins' book, Unlimited Power, The New Science of Personal Achievement. I read it several years ago, and one section in particular is highly appropriate to cutting the delusions of abstraction. The first thing to do is to identify generalizations and fluffy language. Generalizations get in the way of effective action. If you don't have the specifics, it can be tough to collaborate with others on the problem or identify relevant, effective actions. When you hear someone using terms like all, every, never, you can immediately identify them as universals, which in human estimations are almost always incorrect. The best way to counter a universalization is with a clarifying question. Therefore, ask, is it really all, every, or never the case? Always ask for specific evidence to support the claim. Similarly, when someone makes a generalization that you, I, or society should, shouldn't, must, or can't do something, you need to be immediately in the mode of questioning these assumptions as well. As I like to say, it's never healthy to should all over yourself. Another great one is the use of pronouns and ascribing to them actual human characteristics. For instance, they, as in, they say that you shouldn't, or whatever it is. The thing to do in this case is to always ask who specifically is they. They need to be qualified in order to give guidance or dictate policy. Also, generalizations that invoke the adverb to, as in too much, too little, too expensive, too excessive. The antidote here is to ask, compared to what? One of my favorites in this regard is when I see people stating that a free society cannot work out because there will be too little charity or too little security. Again, the generalization needs to be countered with a call for greater specificity. Too little charity compared to what exactly? Americans are exceedingly generous people, and the amount of, I dare say, the term social safety nets available through private charity are already abundant. How much more so once government gets out of the way? Similarly, the question of how much authentic security a free society needs, in light of how many problems are produced by government actors involving themselves in areas outside of legitimate and delegated authority. The Arab Spring, as well as countless other clashes of interests, are the result of interventions in the marketplace, violations of property, and attacks upon the free exchange of goods between consenting adults. In the absence of this belligerence, people would have much less to fear for themselves and their property. As we've discussed many times on this show, the science of justice is discernible only by way of clearly defined property rights. A private property-centric legal and social order allows for specificity because property boundaries are discernible not only for the holder of physical property, but more importantly for others to observe and respect. In episodes 9 and 19, we previously discussed the work of Lysander Spooner, who described the science of justice as being the study of what is mine versus what is thine. For Spooner, this was also the clear delineation between peace and war. We've also in the past described the disutility of saying peace when there is no peace. Peace may be great, a worthy and lofty goal, but at what cost? There is no peace when being abused, exploited, and expropriated. Those interested in ensuring peace must stand ready to repel all those that would aggress against people and their property, to repel those incompatible with a private property-based legal and social order. For the warrior in service to justice and the highest ideals of liberty, we have to discern when to use force and not simply focus on wanton abuses of power. For many generations throughout human society, government was merely the rule of the strong over the weak. Corruption is the natural tendency of politics, and kleptocracy is embedded in the nature of the state. Remembering the wise words of French political economist Frédéric Bastiat, the state is the great fiction by which everyone tries to live at the expense of everyone else. The United States Constitution was aimed at overcoming all past experience, all past political arrangements, and to usher in a new order for the ages, a government whose sole purpose was the preservation of liberty. When we talk in terms of maintaining a free society, it cannot simply be left to generalizations and abstractions. Everyone that yearns to be free needs to be specific in the roles and responsibilities, meaning who exactly is going to do what, using what resources, at whose expense, and to the benefit of whom. This is another way of reiterating what Henry Sumner Maine said, in that the greatest advance in legal systems was the move from one based on status, such as the divine right of kings, to one of contract, with specific enumerated powers. You might be able to see that the U.S. Constitution was an evolution toward more specificity and less abstraction, listing out what the general government could and could not do, with each branch's roles and responsibilities spelled out, as well as for the member states and citizens. This was a great advance in government service, to be sure, but quite obviously the U.S. Constitution has failed to secure the blessings of liberty to American posterity. The next evolution in legal enlightenment has to be one that dispels the belief in any implied or social contracts. The contract between customer and security provider needs to be more explicit, meaning the details need to be more specific and more readily understood by everyone involved, and it needs to be more readily enforced. Roles, responsibilities, and recompense for failing to do all that has been agreed to need to be more clearly laid out. The advance of communications technology, including social media and even more so blockchain ledgers and smart contracts, will no doubt aid in bringing about transparent justice and governance. The way toward that desired future requires clarity of thought and a principled approach. Friends, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Everyday Samurai, and look forward to seeing you next time. Be sure to subscribe to our feed so as to stay up to date with our latest offerings. You can also subscribe to our email list and get updates directly in your inbox when you go to everydaysamurai.life. If you like what you've heard here, give us a thumbs up or a 5-star review, and share the show with someone you think that might resonate with the message. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and be well.